thank you everyone for joining us. We will
Yes.
be getting started. Okay, it is noon, so why don't we go ahead and get started, even though I know other people will be coming in. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn event here at Densho, and it features Evelyn Iritani, who will be talking about her fascinating new book with the long title, Safe Passage: The Untold Story of Diplomatic Intrigue, Betrayal, and the Exchange of American and Japanese Civilians by Sea During World War II. My name is Brian Niiya, and I'm the content director at Densho. I'm particularly excited to highlight this book since it's been a long time in the making. Evelyn actually authored an article on the Gripsholm exchanges, which is kind of the heart of the story, for the Densho Encyclopedia when she was, I think, just getting started on the book quite a while back.
Yes.
So it's been great to see her, what she's learned and how she's progressed and, how the story is fleshed out since then. And then, as we may get into, I have a particular interest in this topic since my own family was part of this story. Um, so the format for today's event is going to be pretty simple, basically divided into three parts of more or less equal length. First, we'll start with Evelyn just giving a book talk, giving a presentation about the book, and it was just released last month. And then that will be followed by Evelyn and I having a conversation about it. And then the last section would be questions from the audience. So as we go along, please write down your questions as they come up. There should be a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen that you can just enter the questions there. We'll get to as many as we can. If you don't see the Q&A tab, if you click, there's like a more icon on the far right, and if you click that, it should show up there. And if you still can't find it, you could also just enter your questions in the chat as well. So any of the above. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Because this is a lunchtime event and many of you are presumably at work, we're going to do our best to end right on time at 1 o'clock. And just to give a brief introduction, Evelyn is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author, a graduate of the University of Washington. She began her career at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer before moving to the Los Angeles Times in 1995 to cover international economics. Her reporting generated garnered numerous awards, including a 2004 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and the George Polk Award for Economics Reporting for a series she co-authored on Walmart. Prior to Safe Passage, she wrote a book with another long title called An Ocean Between Us: The Changing Relationship of Japan and the United States Told in Four Stories from the Life of an American Town, which won a Washington Governor's Writers' Day Award. You can read a longer bio of Evelyn on the event page and also on her website, which is should be in the chat. And with that, I'm gonna just turn it over to Evelyn to start off and to have you tell us about the book.
Well, Brian, I'm so thrilled that you were the one who had to read both of those long titles. I feel like I should get an award just for having the two longest titles of a book in history. I want to start by thanking Densho for hosting this event and also for the incredible work that you've done in preserving the Japanese American history. I couldn't have done my book without the archives of Densho and the Japanese American National Museum and other archives out there. And I have many, many, many librarians and archivists to thank. And I also want to thank you, Brian, because as you said, not only were you a huge resource for me about the Japanese American experience, but you were my entree into your family's history, which is part of my story. And I look forward to talking more about that as we move forward. And again, thank you to all of you out there who are sharing your precious lunch hour with us. I'm going to start by just a little bit of background about this story, which is a complicated one. And I like to give you a little overview. It was almost dawn when Emily Han returned to her home in Hong Kong. She had spent the evening with friends over dinner discussing colonial misdeeds and the expanding tensions across the Pacific and of course, the war in Europe. And she'd ended the evening listening to a Japanese radio broadcast with her boyfriend, Major Charles Boxer, who was Britain's chief spy in Hong Kong. He was one of the few officers who was fluent in Japanese, and she could tell he was worried. She knew he had told his superiors he was concerned about the potential for a Japanese attack on Hong Kong, but they were understandably perhaps distracted by what was happening closer to home. She came home because she needed to feed her infant daughter, Carola, who was just a couple months old, when the phone rang. It was Boxer, and his message was short. Mickey, he said, that was her nickname. It's come. The balloon has dropped. We're at war. Several thousand miles away on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, three American teachers were starting their workday. Harold and Pauline Lane opened the door to find one of their favorite Japanese students, Hiroyuki Miyazawa, waiting in the snow. He was clearly upset. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor and we're at war, he said. But don't worry, I will be your friend no matter what. And then he dashed off. They would not see him again. On the other side of the island, Daniel Brooke McKinnon had just started his first class when there was an announcement over the intercom. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor and we're at war. His Japanese students started clapping their hands and then stopped suddenly when they saw the shocked expression on their teacher's face. McKinnon, the Lanes, and Emily Hahn were among the more than 10,000 Americans caught on the wrong side of the war when Pearl Harbor happened. And the Japanese Imperial Army started working its way across Asia, taking one imperial outpost after another, places like Hong Kong and Singapore and Manila. And it fell to a small group of overworked bureaucrats in the Special War Problems Division of the State Department to rescue these Americans, and that became one of their top priorities. My book, Safe Passage, tells the story of these secret negotiations that led to a diplomatic coup, the rescue of nearly 3,000 Allied civilians, mostly Americans, from Japanese-occupied Asia in the midst of this bitter war, their perilous journey across the ocean, and the painful choices facing people on both sides of the Pacific, but particularly the Japanese in North and South America, who were sent to a country that was no longer, and in many cases, never had been their homes. The logistics of this exchange came together pretty quickly because both countries wanted to get their people home. The two governments agreed to put their enemy aliens and enemy citizens on ships and send them to neutral ports in the middle of the ocean, either India or Africa, where they were traded, and then the captains returned to their home ports. Choosing the people for those exchanges turned out to be much more difficult. And that is sort of part of the heart of my story. I tell the story through six really remarkable individuals and many others, including James Keeley, who is the senior foreign service officer, who had worked his way up the ranks and eventually served as consul in places like Turkey and Canada and Greece when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, and he was called back to Washington and eventually took over the negotiations. Emily Hahn was an intoxicating mix of talent and wit and irreverence. She was an adventurous soul from birth, I think. Went to Africa in her mid-20s and spent 2 years there and wrote a remarkable book. And then ended up in Shanghai in the mid-30s on a vacation with her sister. When Helen was boarded the ship to return home, Emily Hahn stayed behind. She had decided she had found a place and people who she loved. When the war broke out, she was trapped in Hong Kong and faced a really horrible choice, whether to take her infant daughter to safety if she was chosen to be on this exchange, or to stay behind and try to keep her lover alive. Boxer had been captured, injured and captured in the final days of fighting before Hong Kong surrendered. And he was in a Japanese prison camp where the conditions were worsening quickly. The Lanes and McKinnon had sunk deep roots in Japan before the war. They had gotten married, in McKinnon's case, to a Japanese woman. They'd had children and raised them. They'd made deep friendships with their students and their neighbors and their colleagues and fellow parishioners. But when the war broke out, those connections became a noose around their neck. They were arrested and accused of spying for the Americans. And it became a top priority of James Keeley and his colleagues to try to get them out. Across the Pacific, 12-year-old boy, Don Hasawike, loved nothing more than playing catch with his dogs and listening to the Green Hornet radio show and marching in the 4th of July parade and other holidays in his Boy Scout uniform. He told me that at times like that, he never felt more American. On December 7th, Don and his family were returning home from a fishing trip when there was an announcement over the radio that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor and the two countries were at war. Don's father, George Hasawike, was one of LA's most successful produce operators. And Don looked over at his father, who was driving, and he was shaking his head. No, no, no. They spent the rest of the trip home in silence, and when they reached the house in Burbank, there were two men waiting for them. They took George Hasawike into his house for a few minutes and then took him off in a car. Don didn't even get to say goodbye. Over the next few months, George Hasawike, and who was a Japanese immigrant and not allowed to be a US citizen, and Don and his mother May and his two sisters, who were American citizens, found themselves in different prisons in America. And they would eventually come to the conclusion that the only way they could be reunited was on a ship to Japan. Finally, Keitaro Tanaka was a poor Japanese immigrant, the son of farmers, who in the early 1900s, like many Japanese men, decided to leave and try to make a better life. The doors to the United States at that time were closing to Japanese immigrants, and he and many others made their way to Latin America. Tanaka ended up in a plantation outside of Lima, which was definitely something like slavery. And after about a year, he escaped and went to Lima, where he got a job as a barber. Unfortunately, Tanaka and several thousand other Latin Americans got caught up in the war between the United States and Japan. Because prior to the war, the US had made a security arrangement with its Latin American allies that if Japan attacked, they would support each other. The US was particularly worried about its southern border. But as part of that agreement, some of those Latin American countries disagreed to round up their so-called enemy aliens, put them on ships to the United States, where they would be put in camps and eventually used as hostages in these civilian exchanges when the Americans weren't able to fill their ships. These were one-to-one exchanges. The fate of these civilians on both sides of the border depended in part on diplomatic norms like trust, honor, and reciprocity, the kinds of things that were required for these governments to negotiate an agreement, and a series of treaties known as the Geneva Conventions that were negotiated out over decades to protect civilians during wartime. The US officials, Keeley and his colleagues, used those Geneva Conventions to try and get better protection for the prisoners, both in the US and Americans held overseas. And while this wasn't perfect, we know that there were terrible atrocities committed on all sides of this war. Those international humanitarian laws were very important to Keeley. He was able to use them to get important things for Americans held in those camps. And if you read the letters or diaries or talk to anyone who was caught in those camps, you know that things like Red Cross packages of food and medicines and letters from home, those were things that were life-saving. And those, while they might seem small to us, they were critical to people. And that was the kind of thing that the international humanitarian laws required. And unfortunately, at some point early in the war, the Roosevelt administration chose to step back from its commitments to humane behavior and violate its own laws and its constitution, starting with the roundup of more than 120,000 Japanese, mostly American citizens. By taking those actions, it sent a message to its enemies that it was no longer playing by those rules. That gave a powerful propaganda tool to the Japanese government in its campaign against the white imperialists. It invited retaliation against American civilians held abroad. And there are examples in my book where you saw a direct response to what the US did to Japanese and Japanese Americans here. And it made James Keeley's job of getting those people out, of rescuing those Americans, much harder. And we can talk more about that in the conversation. Keeley expected to have problems in its negotiations with the Japanese. After all, they were our enemy in this war. What he didn't expect were the obstacles that were erected by his members of his own government. If we have time, I'd like to read just a little bit from the prologue and then launch into the conversation, which is the most important part. How is our time?
We're good. Yeah. Why
We're
don't we do that?
good?
Yeah.
Okay. I like to read this because I think this gives you just a hint of what the kinds of problems that the US and Japan faced as they negotiated these agreements. Prologue, Yokohama, Japan, June of 1942. The passengers were settling into their cabins and testing their straw mattresses when the ship's engines started to churn. There was a rush to the railing as the Asama Maru pulled away from the pier in Yokohama, Japan. Would they be able to see Mount Fuji? According to legend, a glimpse of Japan's most famous mountain would guarantee their return in happier times. The decks of the freshly painted Japanese troop ship were crowded with America's top officials in Asia and some of the West's most famous journalists, businessmen, and teachers. There were also hundreds of missionaries and their families, many of whom had refused to abandon their posts or had been caught in remote locations when the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. A small group of pacifists risked the ire of their fellow passengers, shouting "Banzai" as the ship moved faster through the waves, guided by the tugboats past the breakwater and into Yokohama Bay. After leaving Japan, the Maru and a second vessel were scheduled to pick up more Allied officials and civilians, including the famed columnist Joseph Alsop, a distant cousin of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, from a handful of Asian ports and take them to the east coast of Africa. There, on neutral territory, they were to be traded for an equal number of people of Japanese descent, who were being sent from North and South America on the MS Gripsholm, a Swedish luxury liner chartered for this unusual wartime mission. The stakes were high. The fate of more than 10,000 American men, women, and children held in Japanese-occupied territories depended on the success of this trade, which the Americans hoped would be the first of many exchanges between the warring governments. Suddenly, the Samaru's engine stopped, replaced by the sound of the anchor chains being lowered into the water. Joseph Grew, the departing U.S. ambassador to Japan, walked over to a group of journalists on the deck. "We're not sailing today," he told them. He didn't need to elaborate. They could tell from the diplomat's pinched face, the pacing, his tone, that something was wrong. Accusatory cables crisscrossed the ocean, couched in polite diplomatic language. The Japanese government was convinced that the American officials had secretly held back some high-priority passengers, which would be a violation of their painstakingly negotiated agreement, and were threatening to call off the exchange. For the Americans, this last-minute ultimatum was just one more example of Japanese treachery.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that's a great introduction to the story. And having read it, it's just a fascinating book, compelling, dramatic. And I think it really, from the perspective of Japanese Americans, it's part of a literature that really expands the story of the World War II Japanese American story and incarceration to this larger international framework, right? That we're for so long it was primarily focused on just what happened in the U.S. So yeah, it does a great job of that. But anyway, I want to start with just asking you kind of a basic question of like,
Mhm.
uh, where did you first encounter the story? And because I know it's been years in the making, and yeah, if you could tell us the origin of the story from your perspective.
Certainly. And I will thank you for having shared already the title of my first book, so I don't have to repeat it. The short title is An Ocean Between Us. But I started researching that book in the early 1990s when I was a reporter for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And I was assigned to do a story on the takeover of a American paper mill in Port Angeles, Washington, by a large Japanese company, Densho. And as part of my research for that book, for that article, which became my first book, I interviewed a professor at the University of Washington, Richard McKinnon. And he was an expert on Japanese culture, which was something that I wanted to learn more about. And in our conversation, he told me that he had grown up in Hokkaido, Japan, and then he and his father had gotten caught there during the war and traded to America as part of these U.S. Japanese exchanges. I had by that point covered U.S. Japan relations and had studied in college and thought I knew quite a bit about what happened during the war. And I was shocked that I had never heard about these exchanges. Um, I was particularly interested in who would have been traded, who were the people who were caught on the two sides of this battle. at a time when the tensions between the two governments had been growing for years. And it was clear as we got closer and closer to the end of 41 that a conflict was possible. So who was it that was still there? And I said at some point I want to get back to that. And then life intervened, and it would be decades before I got the chance to come back to the story after I left the Los Angeles Times and decided to embark on this passion project.
Right. And then so you met McKinnon. Um
Yes,
and
as part of that.
was he still alive at the time that you started I mean obviously when you met him, but when you
Right.
seriously started working on the book?
Unfortunately, he had died. So,
Okay. Right.
but luckily, I had the information from
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
my first book and was able to use that to locate other members of the McKinnon extended McKinnon
Right.
family.
Okay. And then
And that helped me on that piece of the
right,
story.
right. So besides him, how did you choose the other kind of main characters?
That, for a nonfiction writer, one of your big nightmares, I guess, going into a project like this is will you find
Yes.
people
Right.
who you can tell the story through since you can't make it up. I was fortunate that on both sides of the Pacific, both from the Japanese and Japanese American side and from the Americans captured in Asia, there were fascinating people. And these ships, the Gripsholm and its Japanese equivalents, were, like the Lusitania or Titanic. They were filled with fascinating, important people who had chosen to make their lives in across the Pacific. And so I was fortunate enough to find Emily Hahn, who was the New Yorker writer and who was one of the few people who had written a bit about her experience on the Gripsholm and had also written a book about her life in China. She's an amazing writer, and I would recommend any of her books to you if you're interested in the life of a pioneering American female writer and China and Africa. She wrote, and honestly, she wrote hundreds of books. So there's a lot to consume, and I recommend it highly. And James Keeley was a diplomat who obviously came to manage this project, and luckily, the National Archives have all of the diplomatic materials conserved from that time. That I will say that our National Archives are a national treasure, and we must do everything to protect those libraries that hold our American history. Um, and he also had his own personal writings and letters and documents at Princeton. So he had a rich resource. That then on the Japanese and Japanese American side, Archie Miyamoto. I don't know if you know Archie, but he had done a really pioneering manuscript on the Gripsholm exchanges. Archie's family was on that second exchange. And I met him early in my research, and he was very generous in my work, and I owe a lot to him. Not only sharing his family story and what he had accumulated, but he was my entryway to locating other Japanese and Japanese Americans who were on these part of these exchanges. By the time I started my research more than 10 years ago, many of them were no longer with us. And unfortunately, since I did my interviews with them, many more have died. There are very few now, people who were actually on the Gripsome still alive. So, that finding somebody like Archie was that he was a treasure. And then I was able to start to reach out to others. And the as I said, McKinnon and the Lanes were I located through that original story and came to find that they played a real pivotal role in these exchanges because they were held. Both the Japanese initially did not want to let them go, and the Americans very much wanted them. And the Hasawike family, of course, George Hasawike and Don, his sisters, and his wife May, their story became an important one in part because Don and his sister Sumie, who are still alive when I started my research, were willing to share their stories. And we had several years worth of meetings over their dinner table where they spoke about what was a very painful part of their life and not something that they'd shared with their family or many other people. So my my main characters, every one of them I was just fortunate to locate.
Were there other stories you really wanted to tell, but the sources just weren't there, or for other reasons that you couldn't tell their stories?
I think the biggest piece of this story that I didn't feel like I was able to tell as deeply as I wanted to was the Japanese side of the negotiations.
Mhm.
Um, I will start by saying, as I indicated earlier, there were, 3,000 people on each side of these two exchanges, and every one of them had an interesting story. There are many more books that could be written about the people on these exchanges. Um, but in particular, when I started this, I wanted it to be a story that told this from as many of the perspectives as I could. I really wanted to have an American diplomat and, if possible, his Japanese counterpart, and be able to explain in the diplomacy part of this how the governments were making their decisions, what things influenced when they decided to push forward on an issue or pull back. There were times in the negotiations, for example, when the Japanese just quit responding. And the Americans weren't sure whether they had, this was over or whether there was something happening on the Japanese side. One of the issues there were so many different issues that got in the way, but one was logistics, just the logistics of trying to find ships. I mean, the Japanese were using troop ships for this exchange, and that took valuable ships out of rotation for the military and the U.S. as well. So there were times they were short on fuel. So there were times when the lull in the negotiations might have simply been due to something like that. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't want. Um, and then obviously there were the issues that we can discuss later about just the problems with agreeing on who should be included on the
Yeah,
exchange.
yes, yes. And I do want to acknowledge Sharon Oda, her comment that her uncle was Archie Miyamoto and her dad Sam. And I knew both of them slightly as well because of my family's connection to the Gripsholm story. And her daughter Rachel has been doing some writing and research for a law review, and I think we've also corresponded. So I just wanted to shout them out.
Yeah, that's great.
Also, I will also emphasize that if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A, and we'll get to them, as many of those as we can. So go ahead and write those down as things come up. Um, the next thing I wanted to ask was, um, for many Japanese Americans in particular, talking about this period, especially about connections to Japan, is something that a lot of Japanese Americans were reluctant to do, given the kind of, super patriotic, framing of the incarceration that's kind of been dominant for at least the first 50 years after the war. I'm wondering if the Hasui case or other Japanese Americans you talked to, there was any reluctance to talk about this topic, or enough time had passed by that people were now willing to openly share this.
I feel that there was definitely varying degrees of reluctance to discuss it, and it depended in part on how their experience had gone. I think, first of all, the people that were on the exchange that I was fortunate enough to talk to were children of various ages, right? They all the way from teenagers, maybe 12 to 13, 14, down to 3, 4, 5 year olds. So their knowledge, their memories of this were hard to bring up, right? There would be certain events that were emblazoned on their memory, and one of them was a man jumping overboard on the Japanese when the Japanese ship was making its way to the meeting point. Every one of the people I interviewed could remember that moment. And for a child, I think that was probably a. But this it was a particularly. I mean, we all know that it was hard for our parents' generation to discuss the war. I personally was not able to get a lot from my father and mother about their experiences. Um, I think it was particularly hard for people involved in these exchanges because there was a lot of complex emotions and feelings about going to Japan. They were that the decision about whether to be included in the exchange was in some parts out of their hand. They were chosen by the Japanese government, provided a list of passengers that it wanted, and the Americans provided a list of categories of people that they wanted. In the American case, it was, the diplomats and the most important business people and journalists and people in prison and women and children and the sick people. On the Japanese side, it was a list of specific names that they wanted, and including, of course, the high priority people, the diplomats and journalists and business people, but also people who were important people in the Japanese community who were imprisoned. Both sides wanted to get their people out of prison, and this was very complicated by the fact that the Americans had imprisoned nearly all of the Japanese and Japanese Americans. They'd taken them from their homes and spread them out across America. And the US officials who had to find them, just finding them was a logistical nightmare, right? They were no longer living in their homes. But then they would ask people if they wanted to be part of the exchange. The people did not know why their names were on the exchange list. Then they had to make the decision. Did they want to go to Japan? For many of these families, they were separated. The husbands were in federal prisons, rounded up in the first group of people under the Alien Enemies Act. They were separated out. Their wives and children, their spouses and children were usually in these WRA prisons, right? But they were separated, so they had to make this very important decision without the advice and of the most important people. They didn't know what was going to happen to them when the war broke out, and for many of them, the government had taken their homes, their businesses. They had no idea what they were going to be returning to, or if they would be allowed to return after the war ended, especially if Japan lost. Or, they had no idea what was going to happen to them. So, and just to add another layer of complexity, many of these people had children or members of their family who were trapped in Japan when the war broke out. They were studying there. or they'd gone to visit someone, or maybe they had ailing sick parents there. And so all these things were and plus, of course, overriding everything, the American government had rounded them up and essentially accused them of being disloyal. So there was for some a bitterness. All these things were went into the decisions about whether to agree to go to Japan. And what surprised the Americans government, and I think the Japanese government, was that most of the people in these camps did not want to go to Japan, in spite of all the things that had happened to them. Japanese immigrants who had not been allowed to become US citizens, and of course, Japanese Americans for whom their home was here. This is why the American government had trouble filling its side of the ship. In addition, the US military did not want to allow many of the people that the Japanese government wanted. They did not want to allow them to go back to Japan or go to Japan because they thought they might be able to help the Japanese government in the war. So the Japanese government would send over this list of people. The US government had to find them. Then they had to find out if they wanted to go. Then they had to run their names through the US military, which in many cases said no, they can't go even if they want to go. And James Keeley then was left with trying to figure out, how do I fill my ships?
Yeah, such a complicated story in so many directions, huh? So, we have a couple of great questions that I'm going to turn to now, and I have many other questions to ask you too. So
Yeah.
we'll get back to those later. But I'm gonna go to the questions from out there. Christine Dennehy writes, "Thank you for a great talk. Can you please elaborate on the materials you use from the National Archives? What kinds of documents did you use? Did you encounter any particular challenges or surprises, etc., as you did your research?"
I used documents I mean, the first and foremost was the documents from the State Department. So both the Asia Pacific Division of the State Department and the Special War Problems Division, which was a special group within the State Department that was tasked with everything that happened overseas that wasn't military. So they were involved with consular duties, getting money to these people who were Americans who were trapped overseas. And, the Japanese part of the war was just part of what they were also dealing with, everything happening in Europe and everywhere else. A very, very hardworking group of people. So but also all the military archives that were held, and then the archives for the WRA camps, that group of archives, and the Justice Department and Treasury Department. I was very fortunate because the Hasuike family, who spent so much of their time with me, also gave me access to documents that Michie Weglin had helped research for their family at a time when they were trying to find out if they could get compensation for any of the things their family had lost. George Hasuike, as I said, was one of the most prosperous, um, uh, you know, uh, businessmen in Little Tokyo and before the war. And his markets and his produce operations, his homes, everything were taken. And the Michio Weglin did help them research a lot of this. And that's how I discovered both, a lot of the stuff that had happened with both the family, but also the fact that the IRS had started an investigation into his taxes while he and his family were imprisoned, and they were expected to try to launch a response to this tax investigation from prison.
Right.
Um, Another injustice.
Right, right. And similarly, I mean, this you don't cover this in your book, but similarly, California started to launch alien land law escheat cases against Japanese Americans who were in camp because they could now it was difficult for them to defend themselves. So that
Right.
also happened. But anyway,
No, I'm
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
I'm not sure I fully answered that. I mean,
Yeah,
those were I would say the most important, document
right.
areas. The one area that I had the most problem, I was able to get to the documents was for the Japanese Latin Americans.
Hmm.
Uh, those files were really archived, hidden, I would say. But I was able to find files for the people that I was looking at, the Japanese Peruvians who had been brought up and then were traded to Japan.
Great, thank you. Uh, a, a question from Cindy Floresca. I hope I pronounced that right. Writes, my grandparents were on the second exchange. They were imprisoned at Minidoka while their two children were Kibe living with their elderly grandfather in Japan. They requested the exchange to be with their children. Did they face a lot of backlash from others in the camps as being traitors?
Well, again, I can only tell you what I was told by some of the people I talked to. And what I know is that they felt like they were being treated as that they were being treated as disloyal because their families had been chosen
Right,
to go. The questions always were, I mean, they didn't know why they were chosen, right? They didn't know why their names ended up on a list, at the administration building in Minidoka. They just ended up there.
right.
And so the fear, and I think the feeling they had was that people thought that they had either done something wrong or for some reason been selected by the US, by either the US government to get rid of them or the Japanese government because they might be useful, or there were just the lack of transparency. People didn't, this whole thing was so chaotic, that I think it made it very, very hard for people. And I think that's one of the reasons it was hard to discuss this as why to share these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Another question from the audience, Beth Williams Purcell writes, for children going to Japan on these exchange ships, they were going to a country that many perhaps had not been to before. Did any of your interviewees or archive materials talk about their experiences coming to Japan? This reminds me of the Mexican reparation crisis of the 1930s, when many Mexican Americans' children, U.S. citizens, were taken to Mexico with little experience of this place.
Well, thank you for pointing out that the parallels with what happened to the Mexicans, because I think one point I like to make is this was not voluntary.
Hmm.
That this is, when we talk about today about people voluntarily leaving the U.S. I mean, if you're in prison and you're given a few options, everything's
Right.
been taken from you, right? But the Japanese Americans, the people that I did have a chance to speak to, and I had, about a dozen people that I was able to locate who were still alive, including Brian's mother, Alice, who was really wonderful in answering my questions. Did talk about how hard it was for them. I mean, and I described this in my book,
Yeah.
to be dropped in the middle of a country. Not only did they not speak the language in many cases and were visibly different by the way they walked, talked, looked, but this was a country on the losing end of a war.
Right.
So the people they were coming to, their families, the relatives who were accepting them, were uh, in some cases incredibly generous, in other cases not necessarily so, because they were a burden. I mean, the Japanese were having trouble feeding themselves.
Yes.
And so to have these people come now, relatives in the and also unfortunately they, Don Hasuike and his sister talked about them, people bullying them at school because they were they were the enemy. The Japanese students considered them Americans.
Right.
So suddenly they are an enemy again. Um,
Mhm.
and so yes, it was a very difficult experience
Right.
there
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, it's just kind of ironic that Nisei in the US and in Japan were viewed sort of similarly in being, suspect loyalty from opposite directions, you know. And yeah. So there's not a lot of literature on this, but there's some, and it's just
Hmm.
fascinating of that story.
Yeah.
So
And Brian, you and I have talked about this, but I think I want to learn much more about the experience of the Kibe who were there when the
mhm.
war broke out and
Yes,
then
yes, yes.
Nisei and
Yeah, yeah.
their experiences in Japan
Right,
because
right, right, right. Yeah,
um
there's actually two recent academic books that look at that story of the Japanese Americans who were in Japan before the war and then during and after,
mhm.
um, which are both worth reading. I reviewed them on our blog. Hopefully, maybe Courtney can add a link to that. But yeah, there's after years of very little being written about it, I think there's more interest and more research now being done on that part of the story. For many Japanese Americans, that's the missing chunk of history, the
Right,
experience of the Japanese Americans who were in Japan, caught in Japan before, during, and right after the war,
right,
and of
right.
which intersects with your story, because like my family's story and those who went on the Grips home, they were part of that group who end up, in war-torn Japan as Americans.
I
So
wonder, this is like a fabulous time to to have you talk a bit, Brian, about your family's experience because it really does span the this story and beyond because of your, where your brothers ended up and their experience. And I'm curious how this resonated in your family, how
mm,
this experience resonated.
sure, yeah, and we're almost at the end, so I can't go into too much detail, but I'll just say that the basic story is that my grandfather was a Issei community leader in Hawaii. He was arrested, and in turn, the rest of the family end up from Hawaii getting taken to internment camps on the continent, and then they end up as part of this exchange. So the whole family, and it's similar to the Hasuikes, the way they could reunite is by being on this exchange ship and going to Japan. And so my mom and her sister and two brothers, all American Nisei, born and raised in Hawaii, end up in Japan or Japanese territory. And the long story short, my grandfather and the youngest son, my mom's youngest brother, both died on the Awamadu on a trip from Singapore to Japan. My mom and her sister and her mother end up in war-torn Japan. And my, oldest uncle ends up in the Japanese army, involuntarily conscripted, as quite a number of Nisei were during that time. So that was always a part of my family story. And, my mom, I'll always be grateful. She was one of the Nisei who um, uh, openly told that story to me, what was not one of the Nisei who hid the story of war and camp. And I think that influenced, what I ended up doing as a career is with that knowledge. Yeah,
Well,
but
we owe a lot to her, and I really hope your family story is worth a book. So I hope that happens someday.
yeah, it's funny. As much as I am interested and have written about other Japanese American experiences, I haven't done it for my own. And this is not an uncommon phenomenon, apparently. So, but I will. She did really enjoy chatting with you, and she was just honored and excited, and I wish she could have been around to see the book, but yeah, you came along at a time when it was really good for her to have those conversations. I guess it was all in writing,
Yeah,
but yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, she was very happy to engage with you. So um, we only have a few more minutes. So what I wanted to end with is a question about you've been mulling over and thinking about and actively working on this book for quite a while. And over that time, of course, our politics and issues in the US have dramatically shifted. And I'm wondering, you know, how or if this affected the way you wrote the book. I mean, is the book you wrote, would it have been a different book had you written it 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Or how does the calculus of the current political conditions enter into how you wrote it?
That's a really good question. Um, I am not sure whether it would have changed the book itself. Um, I don't really talk about our current situation in the book, but I do in the epilogue.
Yeah,
Um, but it has definitely influenced my message, my takeaway.
right.
And that is when I first started this book, I wasn't sure people would even believe some of the things I've discovered about what happened. For example, the US reaching across the border and having governments round up Japanese Latin Americans to use, in these exchanges. Um, Obviously, today we are seeing our government do some of the same things that occurred in this piece of lost history, including the use of the Alien Enemies Act to round up
Yeah,
immigrants, pressuring immigrants to self-deport, which is anything but voluntary,
right.
and disregarding international laws, the kind of humanitarian laws that protected our civilians overseas then and will protect our civilians today if they are enforced. It just really we're now in a situation where the importance of our government's adherence to rule of law and due process and all these things is so much more critical. And so my message is very different today than it would have been 10 years ago. But the book itself probably is not so different.
Mm, great, thank you. And then quickly, do you have a next project that you're working on?
I don't. I have dedicated myself wholeheartedly to getting the message out about this book.
Okay.
I do have an idea of something, but it's not fully formed yet.
Okay.
And my granddaughter wants me to open up a hospital for stuffed animals. So, I don't
Priorities,
know.
priorities. Well, I have many ideas for you. We'll talk offline and maybe I could sell you on some of these.
Okay.
Um, so we're just about at the end of our hour. So thank you so much, Evelyn, for joining
Oh,
us. There's much more I'd love to talk to you about, but I want to be respectful of people's time. And I also want to thank Courtney Y, who's our
oh,
education and public
yes.
programs manager, who's behind the scenes running
Yeah.
the Zoom, and Jennifer Noji and Mia Schultz, who've helped coordinate the work with Evelyn. Jennifer did a blog post interview with Evelyn that's on our Catalyst website, and have helped promote the event. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to the audience for sticking with us. Those are some great questions you asked, and yeah, I hope to you'll join us when we do another one of these sometime, maybe with Evelyn's next to be determined book. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah,
I agree. I
thanks
just want to
everyone.
agree. Thank you to Densho and Brian for all you've done. And I have a website with contact, and if there are questions that didn't get answered, please reach out to me. I'd love to connect.
Great, thank you. And it really is, honestly, a really compelling book. So if you're at all interested, it's well worth your time. So Okay, so thanks everyone. And
Thank
just
you,
to warn,
everyone.
it's gonna end abruptly. It's not because we don't like you, but that's just the way the system works. So, but
Okay.
have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for